The restaurant fell silent, every pair of eyes in the room locked on the unfolding scene. Kelvin Hart, dressed casually in a black hoodie and jeans, stood in the middle of the lavish dining area, his expression a mix of calm and confusion as the waitress's words echoed through the air. "I don't know how you even got in here," the woman sneered, her tone dripping with condescension. "This isn't some fast food joint, and we don't cater to people like you." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Some diners shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others shamelessly stared, their curiosity overtaking their sense of decency. Kelvin's face was unreadable, but the spark of tension in his eyes was unmistakable. For a moment, no one moved. It was as if the entire room held its breath, waiting for what would happen next. And then, Kelvin's lips curved into a small, almost imperceptible smile. "I don't think you know who I am," he said quietly, his voice carrying an edge of authority that silenced the murmurs in the room. The waitress crossed her arms defiantly, her eyes narrowing. "I don't care who you are," she spat. "You don't belong here, and if you don't leave now, I'll call security." The tension was so thick, it felt like the walls themselves were closing in. Everyone was waiting, some hoping for a confrontation, others simply hoping it would all end quickly. But instead of arguing, Kelvin tilted his head slightly, his smile never faltering. "Go ahead," he said, his voice steady and unnervingly calm. "Call security. Better yet, call the manager. Let's sort this out." The waitress hesitated, her confidence faltering for the first time. She glanced around, realizing that the audience was no longer entirely on her side. Yet she doubled down, turning on her heel and storming toward the back. As the door swung shut behind her, Kelvin turned back to the diners, offering them an apologetic shrug. "So, sorry to ruin your dinner, folks," he said lightly. "We'll try to make this quick." The room erupted into whispers as everyone speculated about who this man could be and why he seemed so unfazed by the humiliating encounter. Kelvin took a seat at the bar, his demeanor calm but his mind racing. This wasn't the first time he'd faced this kind of treatment, but something about tonight felt different. He wasn't just another guest in the restaurant, he was the guest, the owner. And this situation wasn't going to end the way that waitress thought it would. Hours earlier, Kelvin had decided to stop by the restaurant unannounced. It was one of his favorite properties, an upscale, Michelin-starred dining establishment nestled in the heart of Beverly Hills. He'd purchased it a year ago, quietly keeping his ownership under wraps to ensure the staff treated every guest equally. The idea had always been to maintain the restaurant's high standards and reputation, but tonight was a stark reminder that even the most beautiful places could harbor ugliness. When he walked through the doors earlier, he had felt proud of how the restaurant had flourished under his ownership. The interior was a masterpiece of design-rich wood paneling, warm lighting, and gold accents that made every corner feel like a luxury retreat. But the moment he approached the hostess stand, the night began to take a sharp turn. The hostess, a young woman named Emily, glanced at him with a polite but distant smile. Her eyes darted to his casual attire, and her demeanor cooled instantly. "Do you have a reservation?" she asked, her tone clipped. Kelvin raised an eyebrow. "I don't, but I figured I'd grab a seat at the bar if that's okay." Emily hesitated, her smile tightening. "We're fully booked tonight," she said, glancing over her shoulder as if to confirm the restaurant was bustling, which it was not. Kelvin didn't argue. Instead, he stepped aside and pulled out his phone, scrolling through his contacts until he found the general manager's number. Before he could dial, another hostess walked by and recognized him instantly. "Mr. Hart," she exclaimed, her voice warm and welcoming. "It's so good to see you again. Would you like your usual table?" Emily's head snapped up, her eyes widening in realization. Kelvin smirked, but said nothing, allowing the second hostess to escort him to the bar as Emily awkwardly avoided his gaze. But that was only the beginning. Back at the bar, Kelvin had barely started his drink when the waitress name tag read Pamela approached him. From the moment she opened her mouth, it was clear she had no idea who she was talking to. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone flat and uninterested. Kelvin smiled politely. "Just looking over the menu. What would you recommend?" Pamela sighed audibly, her body language radiating impatience. "Well, that depends. Are you planning to order something, or are you just here to waste time?" Kelvin's smile faltered, but he brushed it off. "I'll take the steak," he said. Pamela snorted. "Of course you will," she muttered under her breath, loud enough for him to hear. Kelvin set his menu down, his eyebrows knitting together. "Excuse me?" Pamela crossed her arms. "You heard me. Look, we don't get many people like you in here. And when we do, it usually means trouble. So why don't you finish your drink and move along before you cause a scene?" And now here they were, with Pamela marching off to call security, or the manager, or whoever she thought would back her up. Kelvin leaned against the bar, swirling his drink in the glass as he considered his next move. He had dealt with people like Pamela before, people who judged others based on appearances, never bothering to look deeper. But this time, he had an opportunity to teach her a lesson she wouldn't soon forget. The door to the back swung open again, and Pamela returned with the manager in tow. The man looked frazzled, his eye as darting between Kelvin and Pamela as she launched into an animated explanation of why this random man didn't belong in the restaurant. The manager held up a hand, cutting her off mid-sentence. "Pamela," he said slowly, his face pale. "Do you have any idea who this is?" Pamela frowned, glancing at Kelvin with confusion and irritation. "No," she said. "Should I?" The manager turned to Kelvin, his expression equal parts panic and apology. "Mr. Hart, I'm so sorry," he stammered. Kelvin didn't say anything. He simply sipped his drink, waiting for the moment the truth would sink in. Pamela's eyes widened as realization dawned on her. "Wait, what?" "Him," she asked, pointing at Kelvin. "Yes," the manager said, his voice trembling slightly. "He owns this restaurant." The room fell into a stunned silence, all eyes once again on Kelvin as he set his drink down and stood. "Now," Kelvin said, his voice calm but commanding, "let's talk about how you treat your guests." Pamela stood frozen, her face draining of color as the weight of the revelation hit her. The bustling restaurant, which had been alive with chatter and laughter moments ago, was now eerily silent. Every guest in the room was watching, their curiosity turning into disbelief. Kelvin Hart took a step forward, his presence commanding but measured. He wasn't raising his voice, but there was an undeniable power in the way he carried himself. "Pamela, was it?" he asked, gesturing toward her name tag. She nodded stiffly, unable to meet his gaze. "Pamela, I'd like you to explain," Kelvin continued, "why you thought it was okay to speak to me or anyone else in this restaurant the way you just did." The manager shifted nervously beside her, clearly caught between his obligation to protect his staff and his desperate need to salvage the situation. "Mr. Hart," he began cautiously, "I assure you, this is not how we typically treat our guests." "Ill person, alien sure." Kelvin held up a hand, cutting him off. "I'm not talking to you right now," he said firmly, his eyes locked on Pamela. Pamela swallowed hard, glancing around as if searching for an escape. When none presented itself, she finally stammered, "I didn't know. I didn't know you were the owner." Kelvin tilted his head, his expression unflinching. "And if I wasn't?" he asked. "If I were just another customer who walked through those doors tonight, would you still think it was okay to treat me like that?" The question hung in the air, heavy and unforgiving. Pamela opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. The guests murmured quietly amongst themselves, some shaking their heads in disapproval. Kelvin turned slightly, addressing the room. "You know," he said, his voice carrying just enough volume for everyone to hear, "this restaurant was supposed to be a place where everyone feels welcome. That's why I bought it. That's why I've invested so much time and energy into making it what it is today. But tonight," he paused, his gaze sweeping the room. "Tonight, I'm wondering if I made a mistake." Pamela flinched, her face now a deep shade of red. The manager looked as though he might faint, his hands wringing together anxiously. Kelvin let out a breath, turning his attention back to Pamela. "You're lucky I believe in second chances," he said finally. "But a second chance isn't a free pass. You're going to have to earn it." Pamela blinked, confused. "What do you mean?" she asked cautiously. Kelvin gestured toward the kitchen. "Take off your apron and go back there," he said. "You're going to spend the rest of the night washing dishes and reflecting on how you handled this situation. And tomorrow, we're going to have a very long conversation about your future here." Pamela hesitated, her pride warring with her fear of losing her job. But the look in Kelvin's eyes made it clear there was no room for Nigod Ayashin. Reluctantly, she nodded and walked toward the kitchen, her head bowed. As the door swung shut behind her, Kelvin turned to the manager. "We'll talk later," he said, his tone sharp. "Right now, I have a dinner to finish." Kelvin returned to his seat at the bar, signaling to the bartender for another drink. The tension in the room slowly began to dissipate as the diners turned their attention back to their meals, though the buzz of whispered speculation lingered. The bartender, a young man with an easy smile, placed a fresh glass in front of Kelvin. "On the house, Mr. Hart," he said with a grin. Kelvin chuckled softly. "Appreciate it," he replied, raising the glass in a small toast. For a few moments, he allowed himself to relax, savoring the drink and the quiet satisfaction of having handled the situation without losing his temper. But as the adrenaline began to fade, he couldn't help but reflect on how easily the evening could have gone differently. This wasn't the first time Kelvin had encountered racism. It was a reality he had faced for most of his life. But something about tonight felt particularly disheartening. This was his restaurant, his creation, and yet even here, he couldn't escape the biases and assumptions that so often clouded people's judgment. Earlier that day, Kelvin had been in high spirits. He'd spent the morning reviewing plans for his upcoming comedy tour, and the afternoon visiting a community center he had helped fund. When he decided to stop by the restaurant, it was supposed to be the perfect end to a productive day. Chance to enjoy a good meal and see firsthand how his team was doing. He hadn't expected to walk into a storm of prejudice and hostility. As the night went on, Kelvin observed the staff closely. Most of them were hard-working and respectful, but there were a few moments that gave him pause, subtle interactions that hinted at the same biases Pamela had displayed so openly. He made a mental note to address it all during the next staff meeting. Change wouldn't happen overnight, but it had to start somewhere. The low hum of conversation in the restaurant was interrupted by the sound of a woman's voice. Kelvin glanced over to see an older black couple standing near the hostess stand, their expressions uncertain as they spoke with Emily, the same hostess who had initially tried to turn him away. Kelvin's eyes narrowed as he watched the interaction. Emily's body language was stiff, her smile forced, and it was clear she was trying to find a reason to deny them a table. He sighed, setting his drink down and rising from his seat. It seemed the night wasn't over just yet. Kelvin approached the hostess stand quietly, his footsteps muffled by the luxurious carpet. Emily didn't notice him at first. She was too busy fumbling through the reservation book, her smile strained as she spoke to the older black couple. "I'm sorry," she said, her tone overly sweet, "but we're fully booked tonight. You'll need to make a reservation for another evening." The older man, dressed sharply in a gray suit, glanced around the half-empty dining room. His wife, wearing an elegant dress, frowned as well. "It doesn't look full to me," the man said, his voice calm but firm. Emily stiffened, her forced smile faltering. "Well," she said, lowering her voice slightly, "we have VIP guests tonight, and we're reserving space for them. I'm afraid I can't accommodate you." Kelvin cleared his throat, and Emily turned sharply, her face paling when she saw him standing there. "VIP guests, huh?" Kelvin said, raising an eyebrow. "I didn't realize we were in the habit of turning people away when the dining room is half empty." Emily stammered. "Mr. Hardy didn't realize you were still here." Kelvin crossed his arms, looking between Emily and the couple. "I think you've forgotten the policy here," he said evenly. "Why? We don't discriminate, and we don't turn people away unless there's a legitimate reason." "Is there a legitimate reason?" Emily's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. "I just thought—" "No," Kelvin interrupted, his voice firm. "You didn't think. That's the problem." He turned to the couple, his expression softening. "I'm so sorry about this. Please let me personally escort you to a table." The older man gave Kelvin a small, grateful smile. "Thank you," he said, his tone measured. "We weren't expecting such resistance just to have dinner." Kelvin gestured for them to follow him, leading them to a prime table in the center of the dining room. As they settled into their seats, he said, "Order whatever you like. Tonight, dinner is on me." The couple exchanged surprised looks before thanking him warmly. Kelvin returned to the hostess stand, where Emily was still standing, her face a mix of embarrassment and fear. "Emily," Kelvin said, his tone calm but stern, "we're going to have a talk about this later. For now, I suggest you focus on doing your job the right way." She nodded quickly, avoiding his gaze. As Kelvin returned to his seat, the room buzzed with quiet murmurs. It wasn't every day that the owner of the restaurant stepped in so publicly to address an issue like this. For some guests, it was a wake-up call. For others, it was a moment of silent admiration. Kelvin didn't care much about the opinions of the diners. His focus was on ensuring that his restaurant lived up to the values he believed in: equality, respect, and fairness. The rest of the evening was uneventful, at least on the surface. Pamela remained in the kitchen, scrubbing pots and pans with a scowl. Emily kept her head down, checking in guests with robotic politeness. But Kelvin's mind was racing. This wasn't just about one or two staff members acting poorly. It was a systemic issue, and it needed to be addressed from the top down. After paying for his drink, Kelvin left the restaurant quietly, slipping out the back to avoid further attention. He needed to clear his head and think about the next steps. The following morning, Kelvin called an emergency staff meeting at the restaurant. Every employee, from the kitchen staff to the waiters and hostesses, was required to attend. The dining room had been transformed into a makeshift meeting space, with chairs arranged in neat rows facing a small podium. Kelvin stood at the front, his expression serious, as he looked out at the gathered employees. "Good morning, everyone," he began, his voice calm but firm. "I called this meeting because last night I witnessed behavior that has no place in this restaurant or anywhere, for that matter." The staff exchanged uneasy glances, a few of them avoiding eye contact altogether. Pamela and Emily sat near the back, their faces tight with nervousness. Kelvin continued, "This restaurant is supposed to be a place where everyone feels welcome, regardless of their background, their appearance, or anything else. But what I saw last night told me we're not living up to that standard." He paused, letting his words sink in. "I want to be clear. This is not just about the incidents I witnessed personally. This is about creating a culture of respect and inclusion. If you're not on board with that, this might not be the place for you." Pamela shifted uncomfortably in her seat, while Emily looked down at her hands. Kelvin's gaze swept the room. I'm implementing mandatory diversity and inclusion training for all staff, effective immediately, he said. And from now on, we'll have a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination of any kind. That means if you treat a guest or a colleague unfairly, you're out. No second chances. The room was silent, the weight of his words hanging heavily in the air. After the meeting, Kelvin pulled Pamela and Ali aside for private conversations. Pamela was defensive at first, insisting she hadn't meant anything by her comments. But as Kelvin pressed her, she eventually admitted that she had let her biases cloud her judgment. Look, Kelvin said, his tone measured. I'm giving you another chance, because I believe people can change. But you need to prove to me that you're willing to do the work. Pamela nodded reluctantly, promising to do better. When it was Emily's turn, Kelvin was more direct. You're in a position of power as the hostess, he said. You set the tone for every guest who walks through those doors. If you can't handle that responsibility, I'll find someone who can. Emily apologized profusely, promising to take the training seriously and make amends. That evening, Kelvin returned to the restaurant, this time dressed in a sharp suit. He wanted to observe how the staff handled themselves after the meeting. To his surprise, Pamela was back on the floor, her demeanor noticeably more professional. She greeted guests politely and even offered a genuine smile to a group of young black women who entered the restaurant. Emily, too, seemed to be making an effort, though her nervousness was still apparent. For the first time in a long time, Kelvin felt a glimmer of hope. Change wasn't going to happen overnight, but it was happening. As Kelvin sat at the bar, enjoying a quiet drink, one of the bartenders leaned over and said, "You know, Mr. Hart, the way you handled everything, it really inspired us. I think things are going to get better around here." Kelvin smiled, raising his glass in a small toast. "That's the goal," he said simply. But as he sipped his drink, a commotion near the entrance caught his attention. A loud, angry voice echoed through the dining room, and Kelvin turned to see a man arguing with Emily. It seemed the night wasn't over yet. Kelvin placed his drink on the bar and stood up, his sharp gaze fixed on the scene unfolding at the entrance. The man causing the commotion was tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in a wrinkled business suit. His face was flushed with anger, and he was pointing an accusatory finger at Emily, who looked visibly shaken. "I don't care what your policy is," the man barked. "I have an important meeting, and I demand a table right now." Emily tried to maintain her composure, but her voice wavered as she responded. "Sir, I understand your frustration, but as I explained, we're fully booked tonight. If you'd like, I can help you make a reservation for tomorrow." The man slammed his hand on the hostess stand, making the reservation book jump. "Do you know who I am?" he demanded. "I've been coming to this restaurant since before you even worked here." Kelvin sighed, walking briskly toward the confrontation. By now, a few nearby diners were watching, their conversations dying down as the man's voice grew louder. As Kelvin approached, the man turned to face him, his expression a mixture of anger and impatience. "And who are you supposed to be?" he snapped. Kelvin smiled coolly. "I'm the owner," he said simply. The man blinked, clearly not expecting that response. His bravado faltered for a moment before he regained his composure. "Well, maybe you can explain to your employee here why it's bad business to turn away loyal customers," he said, gesturing toward Emily. Kelvin tilted his head, his smile fading. "Let me explain something to you," he said, his tone calm but edged with authority. "We have policies in place for a reason. If the restaurant is fully booked, it's fully booked. No amount of yelling or name-dropping is going to change that," the man scoffed. "You're seriously going to side with her over me? I've been coming here for years." Kelvin crossed his arms. "And in all those years, have you ever been treated unfairly?" The man hesitated, clearly caught off guard by the question. I didn't think so, Vin continued. So, let me be clear. No one in this restaurant, whether it's a guest or an employee, deserves to be treated the way you're acting right now. If you can't respect that, you're welcome to take your business elsewhere. The man's face turned red, and for a moment, it looked like he might argue further. But the murmurs from the nearby tables seemed to give him pause. Realizing that the crowd was against him, he muttered something under his breath and stormed out of the restaurant, shoving the door open with unnecessary force. Kelvin turned to Emily, who looked both relieved and embarrassed. "You okay?" he asked gently. She nodded quickly, her cheeks flushing. "Thank you, Mr. Hart," she said softly. Kelvin gave her a small nod. "Remember, you're in control up here. Don't let anyone bully you into thinking otherwise." Emily smiled weakly, her confidence clearly shaken, but beginning to rebuild. As the evening wore on, the restaurant returned to its usual rhythm. Kelvin stayed to observe, quietly watching the staff interact with guests. He could see small but noticeable changes in their behavior, more attentiveness, more genuine smiles, and a clear effort to uphold the values he had emphasized during the meeting. The next day, Kelvin decided to take things a step further. He called a meeting with the management team, outlining a plan to improve the restaurant's culture. "We're not just talking about training," he said. "I want to implement a mentorship program. Pair up newer staff with experienced ones who exemplify the values we want to promote. And we're going to have regular check-ins to make sure everyone feels supported." The managers nodded, their expressions a mix of determination and optimism. It was clear that Kelvin's passion for creating a positive environment was contagious. Later that afternoon, Kelvin received an unexpected call from a journalist at a popular online magazine. The story of the previous night's confrontation had spread quickly, thanks to a few diners who had shared the incident on social media. "We'd love to do a feature on you and your restaurant," the journalist said. "Your approach to addressing these issues is inspiring, and I think our readers would love to hear more about it." Kelvin hesitated. He wasn't sure if he wanted the attention, but he also knew that sharing his story could inspire others to take similar steps in their own businesses. "Let me think about it," he said finally. That evening, Kelvin returned to the restaurant, this time with a close friend comedian Tiffany Haddish. The two of them had been friends for years, and Kelvin often sought her advice when he needed a fresh perspective. As they sat at a corner table, enjoying their meals, Kelvin filled Tiffany in on everything that had happened over the past few days. "You handled that like a boss," Tiffany said, grinning. "But don't forget to take care of yourself, too. You can't fix everything in one day." Kelvin nodded, appreciating her words of wisdom. "You're right," he said. "But I can't sit back and do nothing either. This place means too much to me." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of raised voices near the kitchen. Kelvin's expression darkened as he stood up. "Stay here," he told Tiffany. "I'll handle it." As Kelvin approached the key, Chen, he could hear Pamela arguing with one of the chefs. Her voice was loud and defensive, while the chef's tone was equally frustrated. "I don't care what you think," Pamela snapped. "I've been here longer than you, and I know how things work." Kelvin stepped into the kitchen, his presence immediately silencing the argument. Both Pamela and the chef turned to look at him, their expressions a mix of guilt and frustration. "What's going on here?" Kelvin asked, his voice calm but firm. The chef, a young man named Marco, spoke up first. "She's been refusing to follow the new procedures you put in place," he said, his tone respectful but exasperated. "She keeps saying she knows better, but it's creating chaos back here." Pamela crossed her arms, her jaw set stubbornly. "I've been working here for years," she said. "I don't need some newbie telling me how to do my job." Kelvin sighed, rubbing his temples. He had hoped that Pamela's attitude would improve after their conversation, but it seemed she was still struggling to adapt. "Pamela," he said evenly, "we've talked about this. Everyone here needs to work together as a team. If you can't do that, we're going to have a serious problem." Her defiance faltered slightly, but she didn't respond. Kelvin turned to Marco. "Thank you for bringing this to my attention," he said. "I'll take it from here." As Marco returned to his station, Kelvin focused on Pamela. "Let's go to my office," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Pamela hesitated, then followed him reluctantly. Pamela followed Kelvin into his office, her steps slow and heavy. The door closed behind her with a soft click, and the tension in the air was palpable. Kelvin sat down behind his desk, gesturing for Pamela to take a seat across from him. She hesitated for a moment before sitting down, her arms crossed defensively. "Pamela," Kelvin began, his voice calm but resolute, "I gave you another chance because I believe people can change. But after what I just witnessed, I'm starting to question if you're willing to be part of this team." Pamela's lips tightened, and she looked down at her hands. "I'm not trying to be difficult," she muttered. "But I've been here longer than most of these people. I know how this place works." "And that experience is valuable," Kelvin said. "But experience doesn't give you the right to dismiss new ideas or disrespect your colleagues. What Marco told me isn't just a small issue, it's a sign that you're resisting the changes we're trying to make here. Changes that are necessary." Pamela's eyes flicked up to meet his, a hint of defiance still lingering in her gaze. "You think all these changes are going to fix everything overnight?" she asked. "This place isn't perfect, and it never will be." Kelvin leaned forward, his expression serious. "I'm not looking for perfection," he said, "but I am looking for progress. And if you're not willing to be part of that progress, then I'm afraid this might not be the right place for you anymore." Pamela's shoulders slumped slightly, the weight of his words sinking in. "I don't want to lose this job," she said quietly. "I've been here too long to just walk away." "Then show me you're willing to change," Kelvin said. "Start by apologizing to Marco and working with him, not against him. Prove to me and to the rest of the staff that you're committed to making this restaurant the best it can be." Pamela nodded slowly, her defenses finally beginning to crumble. "I'll try," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "That's all I ask," Kelvin said. As Pamela left his office, Kelvin leaned back in his chair, letting out a deep sigh. Managing a team was never easy, but dealing with these kinds of issues was particularly draining. Still, he knew that addressing them head-on was the only way to create a positive environment. Later that evening, Kelvin decided to surprise the staff with a tour of appreciation. He ordered a round of desserts for everyone working that night and gathered them in the dining room for a brief speech. "I know the past few days have been challenging," he said, standing at the center of the room. "But I want to thank each and every one of you for your hard work and dedication. Change isn't easy, but it's necessary, and I'm proud of the progress we're making together." The staff clapped, their expressions ranging from appreciative to genuinely touched. Even Pamela managed a small smile, standing near the back of the room. As the night wore on, the restaurant was bustling with activity. Kelvin stayed to oversee operations, offering guidance where needed and stepping in to assist during particularly busy moments. Near the end of the night, Tiffany Haddish stopped by again, this time bringing a small group of friends. She waved at Kelvin from across the room, her laughter echoing above the chatter of the diners. Kelvin made his way over to her table, a smile on his face. "Twice in 1 week? You must really love this place," he joked. Tiffany grinned. "What can I say? Great food, great vibes, and a great owner. How could I stay away?" As they chatted, one of Tiffany's friends leaned over and said, "I heard about what you did the other night. Standing up for your staff and your customers like that, it's inspiring." Kelvin nodded, his smile turning thoughtful. "It's just the right thing to do," he said. "Everyone deserves to be treated with respect, no matter who they are." But just as the evening seemed to be winding down peacefully, a commotion erupted near the kitchen. Kelvin's head snapped toward the sound, and he excused himself quickly, making his way toward the source of the noise. He arrived to find Marco arguing with a delivery driver, who was angrily gesturing at a stack of boxes. "This isn't my problem," the driver shouted. "If your orders—" "Wrong. Take it up with the supplier." Marco, clearly frustrated, was trying to keep his composure. "I understand that," he said, "but we need these ingredients tonight. Can't you at least check with your dispatcher?" Kelvin stepped in, placing a hand on Marco's shoulder. "What's going on here?" he asked. Marco quickly explained the situation, his tone apologetic. The delivery driver, however, seemed more interested in arguing than resolving the issue. Kelvin's expression hardened. "I don't appreciate the tone you're using with my staff," he said, his voice firm but calm. "If there's an issue with the order, we'll handle it with the supplier. But right now, I need you to show a little professionalism." The driver muttered something under his breath, but eventually relented, agreeing to check with his dispatcher. Kelvin turned to Marco. "You handled that well," he said. "I'm proud of you for keeping your cool." Marco smiled, clearly relieved. "Thanks, Mr. Hart," he said. As the restaurant finally closed for the night, Kelvin sat alone at the bar, reflecting on the day's events. Progress was slow, but it was happening. And for the first time in a while, he felt optimistic about the future of his restaurant. But deep down, he knew that the journey wasn't over. There were still challenges to face, and he was ready to tackle them head on.